Calvin and Souza had been listening to the harbor for 37 years. Not the harbor in the sense of the boats or the people or the seasonal rhythm of the working waterfront. Though he knew those too, the way you knew anything you were embedded in for long enough. He had been listening to the harbor the way a mechanic listened to an engine, for the specific sound that told him whether something was working the way it was supposed to work, and the specific sounds that told him it wasn't. He ran the marine diesel repair operation at the far end of the commercial dock. Every boat in the harbor came to him eventually. The dragger captains and the lobstermen and the gill netters and the charter boats, all of them bringing their engines to Calvin's slip. When the engine stopped doing what engines were supposed to do, marine diesel diagnosis required going out in the boat. You could not hear what an engine was doing wrong from the dock. You had to be aboard, underway, listening with the engine running under load. And while you were listening to the engine, you were also unavoidably in the harbor. Calvin had been unavoidably in this harbor for 37 years. He went out in boats that were running wrong, diagnosed what was wrong with them, and noticed while he was out there what the harbor was doing. The current, the surface, the color and smell of the water in different basins at different tide stages and different wind conditions. The harbor had a tidal behavior. All harbors did. But this harbor's tidal behavior had a particular quality that Calvin had spent 37 years understanding. A secondary tidal exchange that happened through a channel behind the old timber breakwater on the harbor's north side, a structure that had been built in the 1930s and that no longer functioned as a breakwater in any practical sense. The timber was still there, the structure still standing, but it breathed with the tide. Water moved through it. During the periods when the harbor's primary entrance was pressed by wind from the north, when the main tidal exchange slowed, the secondary channel behind the old breakwater was what kept the water in the harbor's northern basin from going stagnant. Calvin had never had a precise, technical name for this. He had simply noticed, over 37 years of going out in engines that were running wrong, that the harbor's water quality was different in north wind periods than in south wind periods. A smell, a color, a particular heaviness to the water in the northern basin that told him something was working differently. The smell was sulfurous in a way of water that had been sitting without adequate exchange. Not dangerous, not alarming, but present in a way that fresh tidal water never smelled. He had come to associate that smell with extended north wind periods, and to associate the absence of smell with the return of south or west wind that drove a different tidal pattern through the primary entrance. He had come to understand, over time, what the difference was. His grandfather had documented it first. The grandfather, Avô Manel, in Calvin's family, had come to Maine from the Azores in 1951, one of the wave of Portuguese fishermen who had settled this coast in the years after the war. He had spent his first years here the way you spent the first years anywhere unfamiliar, watching more than you acted, building up a picture of the place from accumulated observation. He had brought with him the habits of a man who had grown up on an island, which included an acute attention to water behavior and a practice of writing things down. The logbooks were in a battered steamer trunk in Calvin's basement, 11 volumes, 1952 to 1978, written in particular mixture of Portuguese and English that the first-generation community had developed as its working language. Avô Manel had been more comfortable in Portuguese, but he had understood that the observations he was making about a Maine harbor would eventually need to be readable by people who were not. Calvin had read them with his mother's help when he was 23, sitting at her kitchen table on winter evenings, his mother reading the Portuguese aloud, Calvin writing the translations in the margin. The harbor had come alive for him across those evenings in a way that working it day by day had not produced. He had returned to the logbooks periodically over the years when something he was seeing in the harbor didn't match his expectations. The Azorean Portuguese was dense and idiomatic in places, but the observations themselves were precise. Avô Manel had been a careful man. The key entry was from September 1958. Tide runs slow when north wind pushes against the mouth. Back channel behind the old breakwater. The water still moves there. Harbor would be worse without it. And then a follow-up in 1963, during a sustained north wind period, 3 weeks of northeast. Northern basin smells bad, but the back channel keeps something going. Without it, I think the basin would close off entirely. The old breakwater breathes. The old breakwater breathes. He had set down the notebook when he first read that sentence. He had been 23 years old, sitting at his mother's table, and his mother had translated the Portuguese, and he had written in the margin of his own notebook and then set the pen down and looked at it. Calvin had read that phrase when he was 23, sitting at his mother's table, his mother reading the Portuguese aloud, Calvin translating into margin, and had filed it away in the category of observations that were clearly true and that he would eventually understand more fully. He had not understood the mechanism at 23. He had understood it by the time he was 40, when 37 years of going out in boats with bad engines had given him enough observations of the northern basin's behavior across enough different wind conditions to see the pattern his grandfather had seen from the water in 1958. He had been watching the secondary channel's tidal exchange ever since. The floating breakwater project had been announced by the Port Authority as a navigation safety improvement, a modern floating structure to be installed at the harbor mouth's northern face, replacing the function that the deteriorated fixed structures could no longer reliably provide. The project was well-funded, professionally designed, and had received its permits without significant community opposition. Calvin had attended the engineering firm's community presentation, not because he had a specific objection, but because he had 37 years of understanding this harbor, and he wanted to know where the new structure was going to sit. The presentation was professional and thorough. The firm had done the environmental impact assessment, the navigational safety analysis, the structural engineering. The floating breakwater was the right solution to a real problem. The harbor's navigational exposure during north wind events was a genuine hazard, and the existing fixed structures were inadequate. Calvin had no argument with any of this. Sitting in that room, watching the engineers lay out their data, he had felt a particular kind of unease that came from knowing something you couldn't prove. Everything on the screen was correct. The hazard was real. The solution was logical. And the thing he knew, the thing that had no place in any of the slides, was a secondary tidal channel behind a structure that every map in that room classified as obsolete. He had attended to understand the geometry. Now he understood it, and it sat in him like an unresolved equation. When the project engineer showed the installation diagram, Calvin had looked at the position of the floating breakwater relative to the old timber structure and understood immediately what the new installation would do to the secondary channel. The floating breakwater, positioned at the harbor mouth's northern face, would close off the back channel's connection to the outer bay, not physically demolish it. The old timber structure would remain, but the floating breakwater's positioning would block the tidal exchange that moved to the back channel by eliminating the pressure differential between the inner harbor and the outer bay during north wind periods. The back channel's breathing was driven by the interaction between the harbor's primary entrance and the outer bay's north wind pressure. The floating breakwater would eliminate that interaction on the northern face. He had gone home and opened the trunk. He knew which volume to look for. The 1958 and 1963 entries were in the second volume, the one with the water stain along the bottom edge. He had read those entries often enough to know their location in the volume without having to search. He found the 1958 entry and the 1963 entry, and he found several related entries he had not noticed in previous readings. Observations about the back channel's flow during different wind conditions, notations about the smell of the northern basin during extended north wind periods, a 1971 entry that read, "Calvin's father says the old breakwater structure should be replaced. I told him, don't replace it. It still breathes." He read the 1971 entry several times. His grandfather had been arguing against replacing the old timber breakwater in 1971. He had argued on the basis of what the structure was doing hydrologically, not what it was doing as a breakwater. He had understood the distinction that the engineering firm's classification system had not. The classification system was the problem. The engineers were working from a database that sorted structures by design function. Breakwater, deprecated. Deprecated, no active roll. No active roll, no current meter deployed behind it. The baseline had been built on the classification, and the classification had a blind spot exactly where the back channel ran. He spent 2 weeks rereading the 11 volumes, typed out the relevant entries with his own translations, and wrote a 4-page summary of what the logbooks showed about the back channel's tidal exchange function. He submitted the summary. He received an acknowledgement. He had initially thought the North Basin water quality issue might be primarily the harbor's increased mooring density. He had raised this at a harbor meeting 2 years earlier. But the two problems were separate, Mooring density had contributed to the degradation, and the floating breakwater would compound it by eliminating the secondary channel's exchange. He submitted what he had, and let someone with the right instruments determine which cause was which. He submitted what he had, the logbook evidence, his own observations, and the honest acknowledgement that he was a mechanic with 37 years on this harbor, not a coastal engineer, and that he could not predict the precise hydrodynamic effects of what he was describing. He could describe what he had seen. He could document what his grandfather had seen. He could offer the two together, and let someone with the right instruments determine whether they were correct. The project's coastal engineer, a careful man named Dr. Whitfield, had reviewed the Port Authority's records and noted the summary. He had called Calvin 3 weeks after the acknowledgement. Calvin was at the workbench when the phone rang, his hands in the engine compartment of a lobster boat whose fuel injectors had been running lean. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered. He said, "The back channel you're describing, behind the old timber breakwater structure on the north side, you're saying that channel is currently active for tidal exchange." Calvin said, "My grandfather documented it in 1958 and 1963. I've been watching it for 37 years. It runs with the tide, in north wind conditions. It's the only thing flushing the northern basin." Dr. Whitfield said, "It's mapped as a deprecated historic structure in our survey database." Calvin said, "It's deprecated as a breakwater. It's not deprecated as a tidal pathway. Those are different things." Dr. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Calvin could hear him turn a page, looking at the project survey records, presumably, or the structure classification database. He said, "We deployed current meters at the primary entrance and at the main basin. We did not deploy meters in the back channel because it was classified as a deprecated structure with no active function. If it's actively exchanging water, we've missed it in the baseline." Calvin said, "I know you have a classification system. The system says deprecated breakwater. What it doesn't say, what has no category for, is deprecated as breakwater but active as tidal pathway. Those are different things, and your system treats them as one." Calvin said, "I know. That's what I'm telling you." Dr. Whitfield said he would get back to him. He did not hear back for 6 weeks. In that time, Calvin had continued his regular work. Engines to diagnose, boats to fix, the ordinary labor of a harbor mechanic season. He went out in boats and paid attention to the water the way he always paid attention, and in the north wind weeks that came through in late October, he watched the northern basin the way he had watched it for 37 years. The project was moving forward. The floating breakwater had a permit, a schedule, a funded contractor. Calvin had done what he could do. He had said what he knew and provided the logbook evidence, and he was waiting. He also wondered whether he was right. Not abstractly, specifically. The logbooks were clear, but the engineering survey had not found the back channel's active function. It was possible the channel had degraded in ways he hadn't noticed. He had watched the harbor and felt the difference in the northern basin during north wind periods and drawn his conclusion. But there was a gap between that conclusion and proof, and he could not close it himself. He thought about Avô Manel's phrase, "The old breakwater breeds." A man who had come to this harbor as an immigrant in 1951, learning it in 2 languages, had observed something the engineering survey had missed entirely. Not because the survey was careless, because its classification system said deprecated. Deprecated said no active function, and no active function said no current meter. Dr. Whitfield called in December. He said, "We ran a dyed trace in the back channel and deployed a temporary current meter behind the old structure during the last north wind event. The channel is actively exchanging water. The flow we measured is small but consistent, and it's directionally opposed to the primary entrance flow during north wind conditions, meaning it's operating as a pressure equalizing secondary pathway, which is exactly what your grandfather described." He said, "We don't know why the channel classification didn't flag this. The structure meets the criteria for deprecated in terms of its breakwater function, but its secondary tidal pathway function is real, and it was not captured in our baseline." Calvin said, "What does that mean for project?" Dr. Whitfield said, "The floating breakwater's positioning will need to be modified to preserve the pressure differential that drives the secondary channel exchange. It's a design change, not a project cancellation. We'll need to review the installation geometry to ensure the north face remains open to the tidal interaction the back channel depends on. The modification was made. The project engineers revised the installation geometry so that the floating breakwater's northern face preserved the water's access to the tidal pressure differential between the harbor and the outer bay, the differential that drove the back channel's exchange. This required relocating one of the anchor points and shortening the breakwater's northern face by 11 feet, which reduced its effectiveness against north wind wave action by a calculable but acceptable margin. The floating breakwater was installed the following spring. Calvin had watched the installation from the dock in the early mornings before his workday began. The crane barge, the anchor lines going down, the new structure settling into its modified position at the harbor mouth's northern face. 11 feet shorter on the north face than originally designed. One anchor point relocated, a calculable reduction in wave protection, traded for a preserved pressure differential that most people at the harbor didn't know existed. The following October, during the first sustained north wind event of the season, Calvin went out in a boat, not a boat with an engine problem, just a boat, and crossed the northern basin slowly, the way you cross water you were trying to read. It was the same as it had been before. The basin was not perfect. The mooring density issue remained, and it was its own ongoing problem that the floating breakwater had done nothing to address. But the heavy, slow, stagnant quality he feared, the smell that came with inadequate exchange during sustained north wind periods, did not appear. The back channel was still breathing, the way it had been breathing since the 1930s, when someone had built a timber structure that eventually stopped functioning as a breakwater and started functioning as something else entirely. Calvin was in the basement the following winter, looking for a parts catalog in the old steamer trunk, when he found the logbooks again. He lifted one out, the 1963 volume, the year of the 3-week northeast storm, and opened to the entry about the northern basin. Avô Manel's handwriting in Portuguese, the English notes on the margin in a slightly different hand that his mother had told was his grandfather's attempt to write in a language he was still learning. 3 weeks of northeast. Northern basin smells bad, but the back channel keeps something going. Without it, I think the basin would close off entirely. The old breakwater breathes. His grandfather had written this in 1963, observing a harbor he had come to as an immigrant 12 years before, learning its behavior in 2 languages, writing it down because writing things down was what careful men did. The die trace had confirmed it 61 years later. Calvin sat in the basement with the logbook for a while. He thought about his grandfather arriving in Maine in 1951 with a language he was still learning and a harbor he had never worked, and 11 volumes he had filled across 27 years of learning both. He thought about what it meant to observe something carefully and write it down and have it sit in a trunk for 60 years and then be confirmed by a die trace. He was not a sentimental man. He was a mechanic. Mechanics understood that systems contained information about themselves if you knew how to read them, and that the reading was the whole of the job. The system didn't care whether you read it in Portuguese or in English, in a logbook or in a current meter. It produced the same information either way. You just had to be paying attention. The harbor had been telling him this for 37 years. Avô Manel had been telling him since 1963. The die trace had found it in a single north wind event. The observation and the instrument had produced the same answer. The engineering survey had needed a die trace and a current meter to confirm what both of them had already said. He put the logbook back in the trunk, the way it had been when he found it, and went back upstairs. The harbor was out there. It was still doing what it had always done, including breathing through the old timber structure on the north side, the way it had been breathing since before Calvin was born, since before the Harbor Authority had classified the structure as deprecated, since before anyone had thought to look for an active tidal pathway in a place that appeared on every map as something obsolete.